Yeah, I'm just starting it right now. Okay, so for today, I wanted to talk about the transition from modern philosophy to postmodern philosophy. And Kant is one of those pivotal figures, just like Thomas Aquinas before him, who was kind of straddling between medieval and Renaissance thinking. We have Immanuel Kant kind of straddling between modern and postmodern thinking. And I personally believe it was his distinction between phenomena and noumena that opened the door to postmodern thinking in the West. Because basically, what Kant is saying is we cannot trust our sense perceptions. We need to rely on reason. So Kant would fall under the category of rationalist as opposed to empiricist. And empiricism is just a fancy word that we know things based on our sense perceptions: sight, smell, taste, touch, feel, or feel is touch, sound. Okay. So that's how we know things. Kant is saying, actually, no, because our senses deceive us, or we at least have to be self aware enough to realize that even if we are perceiving correctly, as humans, we have very limited sense perception. We can't hear like a dog, we can't see like an eagle or like an insect that has ultraviolet, we can't perceive the world like a pit viper or a bat. We perceive the world like human beings. But humans have a limited range on the light spectrum, on the sound spectrum, on the touch spectrum, on the taste spectrum, where other animals or creatures that we're aware of may have a much huger spectrum of smell, of sound, of sight, uh, of of seeing different colors. It's amazing, absolutely amazing. So Kant just wants to intellectually be honest and say the world we're perceiving is a construct, like what Berkeley's saying. It's a human projection upon the noumenal world. But we are not seeing the world as it actually is. We're seeing it as it appears to us through our limited human perspective. Now, that being said, he focuses his energy on reason because he believes with reason we can have profound insight and come to an understanding of truth, but not through sense perception. But I think by doing this, when he acknowledges that we can't know the noumena and we can only know the phenomena, but the phenomenal perception is going to be subjective and relativistic, that affects everything, right? Because now all our sense perceptions are individual and subjective. And so Kant wants to use human reason to transcend subjectivity for a universal approach to art, aesthetics, ethics, politics, whatever you want to turn the eye of philosophy on. Kant wants an objective, universal, rational approach. Well, after Kant, remember Kant is Prussian, our next major philosopher is also German, and he is George Friedrich Wilhelm Hegel. And he is writing during the time period of the French Revolution and the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte later on. And it's really quite interesting to see the context of the time in which he's writing and how the politics of the day are kind of affecting his thinking. But what Hegel realized was he had a real historical aspect to his history, and he wanted to show the progression. And hopefully you guys watched that other video I posted where I went into more depth, but I'm just going to do a thumbnail sketch. Basically what Hegel is, he sees history as kind of like an organic growth, and it's really the story of Geist. And Geist is the German word for spirit. And this could be like the spirit of God, like capital S spirit. And so if you think back, I really think he stole a lot from John Scotus Erigena personally. But in all the readings I've done of Hegel, I never never saw him give any credit to John Scotus. And maybe he wasn't aware of Erigena, but I don't know. When I first read Hegel and first read Erigena, I was like, wait a second. I
Could he
think
be
there's a little,
plagiarizing?
right. It was like a lot of plagiarizing going on. And I don't, once again, I don't know if he plagiarized or if it was independent thought that was just incredibly similar. But basically, he's starting in that place of like non being, but out of that non being, Geist is there, the spirit is there. And if you remember in John Scotus Erigena's The Divisions of Nature, that is the fourth division, that which is not created and that which does not create. And we can talk about in that Neoplatonic hierarchy from pure being to non being, we're down in the non being place. But out of non being percolates desire. And out of desire, the physical material world is manifest. But it starts very simple, right? And primitive. And Hegel, you could accuse him of Eurocentrism or ethnocentrism, but he saw the early civilizations of the East as being base developments or lower developments on the human scale. And his journey begins not with savages or barbarians or exotic peoples, but he starts with the Greeks and he says that's really when civilization, at least in the West, is taking hold. It's trying to use reason and transcend superstition. And but the Greeks' problem was they were materialist. And so, even though they produced great philosophy, great art, great literature, it always pointed to the physical material world, whether it was the beauty of their physical material buildings, architecture, their athletic events, their war techniques, even their sculpture or paintings or pottery. It all kind of kept you trapped in the physical. It wasn't transcendental. So the roots are kind of coming out of percolating out of desire, and it's creating the stem, and you have these primitive and barbarous people, and then we get the Greeks, but the Greeks are materialist, and so Geist keeps moving through history, and next stage is Christianity. And when the fullness of time had come and Geist was manifest in the flesh in the form of Jesus, and this is where it gets weird. And I forgot to qualify for Hegel. This is really important. So don't be judging him until we're all done, because Hegel is saying the truth is the whole. You can't just look at the thesis or the antithesis or the synthesis and think you have truth. You have to look at them all together, the black, the white, and the gray, to get the complete picture. All right. So if you just focus on being, the thesis, you're not going to have truth. If you just focus on non being, the antithesis, you're not going to have truth. And if you focus on, I didn't know I was wearing this shirt, becoming, if you focus on becoming, you're missing the whole point. So Hegel's saying if you want the whole truth, you need the thesis being, the antithesis non being, and the synthesis becoming. That is the truth, taking them all together as a whole. This is very Eastern way of thinking. And he actually helped me understand Buddhism and Hinduism much better. Even though he's a German 19th century philosopher, um, I felt like I actually understood Buddhist nothingness for the first time in my life. And let me roll this out for you. Hegel believed that everything and nothing were the same thing by definition. And I'll say this a couple times slowly if you want to write it down because it's so trippy. If I'm bored at parties or Thanksgiving dinners, I'll roll this one out to entertain the audience and cause us think. So So everything is that of which nothing can be added to or taken away from. Because if you can add something to everything, it wasn't everything. And if you take something away from everything, it's not everything anymore. Okay, we got it? Now, curiously, he defines nothing as that of which nothing can be added to or taken away from. Because if you can take something away from nothing, it wasn't nothing to begin with. And if it truly was nothing, you can't take and you can't add something to it or it wouldn't be nothing anymore. So everything and nothing is that of which nothing can be added to or taken away from. Weird. But it ties in so nicely to John Scotus Erigena, where pure being and non-being, or that which is created and creates, and that which is not created and creates, and that which is not created and does not create, are just two different ways of talking about the same thing. They're just at different ends of like this like cosmic loop or donut, right? That's like constantly circulating. All right. I had to say all that before I say this next statement because I don't want you to drag me or Hegel out into the quad and light us up. He says when the Christ was incarnated, Jesus was incarnated as God into the world for the first time in history, God knew himself. Because until this point, God was just monolithic being, its reflection. It kind of is like going back all the way to Parmenides when we talk about if everything is simply one, well, then it means there's no movement, there's no time, there's no division. It's just stasis. Nothing changes, nothing develops, nothing grows. And that's why John Scotus made such a point of the necessity of a trinity if you wanted to have a dynamic, creative, relational God. You have to have the three contained within the one, right? To have that movement. If it's just a solid one, no movement's possible. It's just a static deity. All right. So when Jesus is born and realizes that he is God in the flesh, he is able to look back through time, back to Geist percolating up desire, and know himself as God, and God knowing himself looking at Christ for the first time. Then all those who have Geist, that spirit of God within them, are now Christ bearers, which move through history, because the problem with Christianity isn't materialism, it's metaphorism, in that it's not speaking clearly and distinctly, it's using metaphors and parables and symbols to try to point towards great truth, like the idea of God being our Father. I mean, God isn't biologically siring us or birthing us, but it's a metaphor or a figure of speech to our relationship to God. Now, I might argue that actually we are we are created to our new nature, or our new human nature is quickened and brought to life by the very seed of God, which is produced by the Holy Spirit, and where we become God men and God women. But I don't know if Hegel's going that far, but this idea that we are now Geist bearers or spirit bearers, but if we want to transcend the parables and the metaphors and the symbols, we need to leave Christianity behind, and then we enter into the highest and third movement, was German Romanticism, where Hegel was living and writing from. And so Hegel believed that it was German idealistic transcendental philosophy that had arrived, and fulfilled this philosophical quest. And now God is to return through transcendence of humans with the spirit of God in them back into the Godhead, back into the oneness. So Geist is traveling from non-being through the incarnation, becoming into pure being back into the Godhead. The top is the same as the bottom. So it's like this cosmic loop of God circulating himself through the cosmos, and it is this circulation that is creating human history. How cool is that? So that's Hegel in a nutshell, and his view of history and the movement of Geist. And he believes each of those periods, each of those movements, he has a spirit. He calls it the spirit of the age, which in German is Zeitgeist. So if you hear that word Zeitgeist, it means spirit of the age. And so there was a savagery period, a materialistic Greek period, a metaphorical Christian period, and then pure reason with German transcendental idealism and romanticism. And Hegel basically said when he was done with writing his philosophy, it is finished. Basically, you need to dot a few I's and cross a couple T's, but philosophy has been accomplished. And maybe that's a misreading of Hegel on my part, but I don't think so. I really enjoyed Hegel immensely once I actually started reading the primary source um, material. Any questions on Hegel?
Mm-mm.
Did any of you have the time to read that article I wrote, 19th Century Triad? You read that, Christina?
40 pages.
Good job, woman.
It
That
was
was
supposed
part of my
the one.
master's program where I was trying to get a degree. That was one of my term papers I wrote.
Okay, there were supposed to be 3 philosophers discussed, but it was mainly one. I didn't see the other 2 like sectioned off in the paper.
Who was the main one you thought was highlighted?
Uh I read it like a week ago. I gotta remember. I think it was Hegel.
Yeah, it wouldn't have surprised me if it was Kierkegaard, because that would have been confirmation bias, because I like him the best of those three.
But yeah, there
But
was only one philosopher section. Like there were subsections of that philosopher world. There wasn't like, oh, I'm switching gears and talking about this guy now. You know what
right,
I mean?
right.
And you said in your thesis you were going to talk about the 3.
I probably spent the least amount of time on Marx because I'm least interested in him.
I don't blame you. He's not as cool as like Kierkegaard or Aristotle, but
Yeah, but what's so interesting about Hegel is he's trying to deal with these different worldviews with like ancient pantheism where God and the nature are one. He's trying to deal with Greek materialism where only the physical material world exists, there is no spiritual. And then he's trying to deal with Christianity, which believes in both a physical material world and a spiritual world. So he's dealing with theism, materialism, and pantheism. But in his system, he's blended them all together into one.
Mhm.
And I just think that's really amazing. But what happened after he died, his disciples broke into 3 camps. And guess which 3 camps
Mhm.
they were? You had materialist Hegelians, you had like fundamentalist
Christians.
Christian
Yep.
Hegelians, and you had pantheistic Hegelians. And what I would say to all 3 of those groups is you missed Hegel's point. His point was the truth is the whole. And we
Mhm.
need to show how all of these things are connected and related together instead of fractioning off and just taking the parts we like into our own either Christian, pantheistic, or materialistic group. And so what you're going to see in these next 2 philosophers, Marx is a pure materialist, and so he's going that route. Hegel is a pure He's using Hegel's method, but he's getting rid of Geist. He doesn't want spirit. He doesn't want God. He just wants the methodology. He wants the dialectic, the thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Kierkegaard, on the other hand, wants to keep the spirit, but get rid of the method. He doesn't want formulas and step program. What he wants is the vibrancy and relationship and power of the spirit. And so if there's no more questions on Hegel, oh, and by the way, Hegel was wildly popular in his lifetime. And the classes would just be book solid. And it's interesting because if we have time after Thanksgiving week, remember we're in Schopenhauer, and they taught at the same university, and Schopenhauer would always schedule his classes the same time as Hegel's because he wanted students to have to make a choice between the two of them. But I have a feeling Schopenhauer was lucky to have a dozen students where Hegel probably had hundreds wanting to sit in his lecture hall. In fact, his philosophy was so popular, it dominated Europe for I don't even know how long, but it was the go-to standard of European thinking, especially on the continent. Anyways, in the 19th century, we have Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels living in England, okay, in exile. And this is the same time we have Darwin writing Origin of Species and the Preservation of Preferred Races. In fact, they're contemporaries. That's released in 1859, when Karl Marx and Fred Engels wanted to release the Communist Manifesto that they had been working on together. They actually wanted to dedicate it to Charles Darwin. And Darwin said, thanks, but no thanks. I don't think he wanted to be associated with the Marxist. And the reason they wanted to dedicate it to him is because he had done biologically what they were doing sociopolitically, because Darwin was looking for a material explanation for the origins of life and the diversity of life on the planet, and Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were looking for a materialist explanation to government, to society, etc. And so if you could have a biological proof, like in Darwin, or advocate, it would go along with your more sociological, political aspects. So I wish I had my whiteboard again, but I don't. But that's part of why I showed you those videos, because I drew all these illustrations on the board. But I'll do it in the air for you with my hands. So if we take, basically Marx is using the dialectic and he's applying it to history. And this is where most people know Hegel is from Marx's use of Hegel's dialectic. He's basically applying it to his own socio-political theories. Because instead of Geist being the sinner actor in history, for Marx and Engels, who was history about, or what was history about? You guys remember from your history classes? For Karl Marx, history is the story of class struggle. It wasn't Geist trying to manifest itself in the world. It was humanity trying to free itself from the shackles. Okay. And so if we start with the thesis being that, let's start with Rome, Imperial Rome. The thesis would be the emperor. The antithesis would be slaves. And so you have to look for what is the synthesis, but like what's in between an emperor and a slave. And so this is the imperial system. And so here in the synthesis, what we get is like feudalism. All right. So we move from empire to feudalism. And in that new synthesis, we have the seeds of the new thesis. And so now instead of an emperor, the new thesis is king, and the antithesis to the king isn't a slave, but a serf or a peasant. You see how this is working? So a king is less than an emperor, but a serf is more than a slave. For the synthesis between a king and a serf. And here we enter into like the guild system and the rise of mercantilism and capitalism in the West. And out of that, we get the new thesis is the bourgeoisie. And that's a fancy French term that means those that own or control the means of production. But the antithesis of the bourgeoisie is the proletariat, the hourly day laborer, the wage laborer. They don't own the means of production. They're selling their labor for capital, for money, so they can survive. So what's in between the bourgeoisie, those that own the means of production, and those that are working in the factories? I mean, these people have it better than serfs, but these people don't have it quite as good as a king. Okay, so we're moving towards this grand climax of everything being equal. And so this is where Karl Marx believed enter communism. He thought communism was the synthesis between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. But this is where I think he got it wrong. I think what the synthesis was between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat was capitalism. And then I think the antithesis of capitalism is communism. But this is Fred now. I left Marx at this juncture. His stopped at capitalism. He thought the whole world would unite, everyone would be equal, we would all share in this kind of bliss harmony, where everyone held things in common. You didn't have a stratification of classes anymore, but the synthesis had become complete where we're all equal. But what I think happened is the next movement is capitalism. The antithesis is communism. So what's the synthesis between capitalism and communism? What's in between those two? Very good. Socialism. So, and isn't that what we're seeing in our society right now, like the rise of socialism? But what's the antithesis of socialism? We're also seeing this in our society. The antithesis of socialism is anarchy. The collective versus the individual.
Yeah, and they're working together.
Are they?
Absolutely.
But they're only working together because they're fighting the next iteration. And do you know what the next iteration is between socialism and anarchy? Totalitarianism, which brings you full circle back to the emperor. You have the loop again. Woo! It's so wild. Right now in our political spectrum, we have socialists, we have anarchists, and we have people that want a more like law and order. They wouldn't call themselves totalitarians, but they want a much more authoritarian state. Their enemies would call them totalitarians or fascists, but they wouldn't call themselves that. They would call themselves like law and order, and we're here to bring peace and prosperity and all of that. And one other distinction I want to make between communism and Marxism. I'm going to make a statement, and I want you to see if you can tell me why I at least think it's true. Be a Marxist. Anyone want to take a crack at that? It has to do with the definition of communism and Marxism, of course.
You absolutely froze up. I didn't hear anything you said.
Oh, thank you. The question, the statement I'm making, why would that be the case? Marxism is also known as dialectical materialism. Woo, there's a fancy word. You guys know what materialism is, and dialectic is that thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So he's a dialectical materialist. He only believes in the physical material universe. That is why you cannot be a Christian Marxist. And I'm talking about a spirit filled, knit together with God's own spirit Christian. I'm not talking about because there's lots of Marxist Christians in theology. And there were many Catholic priests that went down to Central and South America and actually worked with the Marxists because they wanted to bring freedom and equality and prosperity to the people under these more oppressive authoritarian governments. But in doing so, they kind of left the gospel behind because Marxists can't accept this idea that man has an immortal soul, that there's an eternal God that created us, that will give an account to him one day. Communism is simply a system in which people share things in common. And I'm not saying Christians have to be communist, but it certainly would be compatible with a Christian worldview. And we certainly saw a version of that in the New Testament. But Marxism is based on this idea that there is no God, there is no sweet by and by, there is no Jesus to come and save you. So if you want a better life for you and your family, you're going to have to take it because the people in power are not going to give it to you. They are not going to give you a bigger piece of the pie. You're going to have to show up with pitchforks and axes and demand your share of the pie if you want a better life for you and your children. And I'm just not, that's not the solution I want.
That doesn't always work in communism. If you did that in a country like China, I'm pretty sure you'd be arrested. Because there's no such thing as freedom of speech in China.
No, only for those in power. They get to do the narrative.
Yeah, but you just said you have to show up with pitchforks and...
That's if you want to overthrow the capitalists that are keeping you repressed.
That'd be very hard to do, especially in a country if you're like in China. But if you're like in maybe...
But they did do it in China. That's how Mao Zedong took over the country, through the Chinese Revolution.
I didn't know there was a Chinese Revolution. Shows what I know about Chinese history.
And Chiang Kai-shek and those who believed in democracy and capitalism fled to Taiwan. And that's why it's like a different country today. Now, China does not recognize it as a different country. They believe it's part of China. But that's where you had the overthrown people trying to maintain the government. They had to flee there because Mao Zedong's troops were victorious. Same thing in Russia with the Bolshevik Revolution and Lenin. When he was sent there, they overthrew the czars, the monarchy, the theistic, ruling, capitalistic, bourgeoisie overlords.
Not theocracy.
Then they introduced
Vladimir Putin.
Their version of communism into the world. But it was
really, I love that Vladimir Putin's really supposed to be just the president, but he's like, he will never give up his power.
Yeah, he's
over
president
Russia
for life, basically.
Mm-hmm. And I'm guessing he has a son to take over after him, just like Kim Jong-un.
I actually don't know if Putin has kids.
Let's find out.
Yeah, okay.
Find it first, me or
Any
Wayne.
more questions? Now, I do want to give a shout out to Marx in the sense of he gets a very bad rap in the West.
He does have children. I don't know how to pronounce their names, but he does have children. Except their last names are Putina instead of Putin.
Yeah, I don't know how Russians work their last names.
Let's stay on topic.
Girl and
Yeah, don't derail me, Christine. So
sorry.
basically, Marx, I think he really cared about the working class. And he was people at the top of the food chain oppressing and dominating the vast majority of the population. And he's just thinking, why are we allowing this? We outnumber them. We can bring equality. And and so I like his passion and his heart. It's just it's his solution I'm having the problem with. And his worldview, because I'm not a materialist. I like the dialectic part, but the materialism part, no, thank you. So, do you see what I'm saying? He kept Hegel's system, but he got rid of God. He liked the scaffolding. He just didn't like the spirit moving through it. All right, so let's move on to Kierkegaard. And how much time do I got? Oh, we're doing good. So Soren Kierkegaard is known as the father of existentialism. Now, there's a lot of competing claims to that title, but I love to give it to Kierkegaard. And he was actually a Christian philosopher living in Denmark. Um, I think it's his dates are like 1800 to 1843. He did not live very long, but he was incredibly and he produced an incredible amount of work and deep and profound work in his lifetime. And basically, if you know anything about 19th century Europe, it was a Christian continent, sending missionaries all over the world, trying to convert the darkest Africa and Southeast Asia and South America. And in Denmark, basically, if you were born there, people just assumed you were a Christian. And Kierkegaard was so disturbed by this way of thinking, attack upon Christendom. Even though he's a Christian, he's trying to wake Christians up and say, you've grown cold, you've grown complacent. You don't even know who it is you're serving or worshiping. You're just following this dead ritual and rules and format. And so he's trying to bring kind of like a shock value into this very ritualistic and rationalized Christianity. And in fact, that was one of his big problems. He believed that people were like intellectual or cultural Christians, but they weren't actual Christians. They knew all this stuff about God and they practiced all these godly things, but they really didn't know God. They knew about God, but they didn't know God. And that's a huge distinction, and it changes everything. In the past, people would ask, what is a Christian? And you could give them like the Nicene Creed or the Apostles' Creed and say, hey, basically, this is what it means to be a Christian. A Christian believes these things. And Kierkegaard said, I don't want to know what a Christian is. I want to know, what must I do to be a Christian? You see the difference? He's taking it from an objective answer to a subjective, personal answer. What must I do? What has to happen in here for Fred Blackburn or Soren Kierkegaard to become a Christian? And that became his quest. But it also upset a lot of people. In his book, Attack Upon Christendom, he said, I live in the most amazing country where virtually everyone is a Christian. Even the Jews and Muslims are Christians. Even the dogs and cats are Christians. But he said, you know what? When everyone's a Christian, no one's a Christian. And I love the point he's making. He's basically saying you're all just conforming to this preconceived standard of what you think Christianity is, but none of you are even interacting with Christ. And so what I'm going to roll out for you now is existential philosophy, but this is a really tricky thing to do because it is virtually impossible to define existentialism. And the reason it's so difficult to define existentialism is because one of its major tenets is the individual. And because the individual is primary, each individual could legitimately have their own definition of what existentialism is. I'll never forget the first book I bought on existentialism. I think it's by Frank McAmary. I think you can still get it on Amazon. It's only like 150 pages or so. But I might be exaggerating, but I don't think so. I think the first 60 pages, not quite half, but close of this book, was a preface. And the whole preface was explaining why he couldn't define what existentialism was. And I just thought, oh my gosh, I love this so much. But what he did instead was he gave themes that many, but not all existentialists might adhere to. So I'm going to give you a list of existential themes, but people who are in that existential category may or may not agree with all of these themes, but they're probably going to agree with a lot of them, if not most of them. So number one, out the chute, the individual. That's what Kierkegaard wanted put on his tombstone. Just write the individual. It's so good. But because the emphasis is on the individual, we are all so unique that no one else can actually know us. Because in order to know us, they would have to live our lives and they would have to share our perspective. And think about times when you have family gatherings or you're talking about a past vacation or a past Christmas or Thanksgiving. Don't you feel sometimes like you're in crazy town? Like you're the only person that actually remembered what happened? Because the other versions of your family's memories, you're just going, that never happened. Are you out of your mind? I mean, what Thanksgiving were you at 2 years ago? And that's the weird thing about a subjective perspective. Everyone could be looking at the same object or event, but be having radically different experiences or perceptions on the content. Also, what happens is because we are all different and we perceive the world differently, and no one else can know us, it leads to alienation and where we feel disconnected from others. I see I'm getting a sign too about my internet. I'm going to have to call my internet provider. I can't be having slow internet. Anyways, alienation because no one else can know us. Even if you have a soulmate level connection with someone and you're totally it doesn't matter because they're not you. And even though you're sharing your most intimate, vulnerable things with them, because they're not you, they don't really understand what you're saying or what you're trying to communicate. They may get a feel of it or inkling, but they really don't know. And that leads to angst. And I love the word angst because it means fear, anxiety, and dread all rolled up into one. But it's a fear, anxiety, and dread of you know not what. It's like a splinter in your mind. It's like there's some level to you where you know the world is broken or something's wrong, but you can't put your finger on it. I love that scene from The Matrix where Morpheus is talking to Neo and he's describing it just like that. He's just like, you have a splinter in your mind and it's just agitating you and it won't go. You know something's wrong, but you don't know what it is. So it leaves you in this state of angst. Kierkegaard's solution to alienation and angst is the person and work of Jesus Christ, because that is what reconciles us to the Father. and we don't have to live in fear, anxiety, and dread anymore. Kierkegaard believes that feeling is because we're alienated from God and we're just living under this dark cloud of condemnation and curse. But through Christ, we're able to pierce that and be connected with the Father through love, and we don't have to have that alienation anymore. Because now, with the Holy Spirit in us, the Holy Spirit knows us completely and fully. We're known. For the first time in our lives, someone actually gets us more than our mothers, more than our best friends, more than our partners. It's intimate, personal love. And Jesus knows us so intimately, he knows not just looking down at heaven upon us, but internally our subjective perspectives and experiences. When you got stood up for prom, Jesus was right there with you in your heart. He felt it. He knew what that was like, right? He knows all of it. And I love this aspect of existentialism. The next theme, and these aren't in any particular order, I'm just kind of listing them as they come to my mind, would be freedom. There's a real belief in freedom in existential philosophy. And what I mean by that is you're making real choices, not just fake choices, but real choices. Eat your heart out, Calvinist. Real choices with real consequences, like eternal consequences. Yep. Oh, was that a high five? Okay. And quite frankly, there's really no point to even talk about ethics or morality if there is no choice, right? Remember what Paul's retort was when people were complaining about, well, if God is so sovereign, why are we being condemned? And Paul's retort, it wasn't very helpful. He just basically said, does the pot ask the potter, hey, what are you doing? Why are you making me this way? No, you're simply made a certain way. But I think what Kierkegaard would interject at that point is that, yeah, he's not saying we have absolute freedom. You don't get to choose what gender you're going to be, how athletic you're going to be, how intelligent you're going to be, what kind of family, social status, ethnicity, nationality you're going to be born in. But what you do get to choose is what you do with what God has given you. And I like using the analogy of crayons. Some of us have been given the Denny's 2-pack, and some of us have the Crayola 264-pack. The point is, what do you do with the crayons God has, right? And some of us are in between. What do you do with the crayons God has given you? That's your freedom. You don't get to choose necessarily how many crayons you get, but you do get to choose what you do with them. And I do like that. The next would be responsibility. Freedom and responsibility are a match set. A lot of Americans want freedom, but they don't want responsibility, right? And it's something I deal with my kids all the time. I have a niece that's just starting to drive, and I'm trying to help make her make the connections that that is a tremendous amount of responsibility to drive an automobile. And if you want the freedom to drive, you're going to have to show me that you're able to control your anger. You have impulse control, right? Because you're behind like a 2,000-pound vehicle. You can't just lose it and plow into someone because they cut you off. So you have to have emotion control. You have to be aware. But you also have to be responsible with things like taking care of your pets, doing the dishes, taking out the trash. I mean, how can I trust you with an automobile if I can't trust you with taking care of your critters, right? So it's not like a punishment or holding something over someone's head. It's simply, to the degree you want freedom, you have to exhibit that kind of responsibility. That's the way existentialism works. They go together. Next, we have authenticity. And authenticity is being true to yourself. Remember Socrates' challenge, know thyself. And then Shakespeare, we have the classic and to thine own self be true. I think that's from Hamlet. To thine own self be true. And so we have these two, this idea of being an individual, but then knowing who you are. Because if you don't know who you are, if you don't know your own identity, I guarantee you there are a lot of people out there who would be more than happy to tell you who you are and what your identity is. And who do you want telling you who you are? Do you want God telling you who you are, or society, or your church, or your mama, or your political party, or your job, or your significant other? No. Know your true self. And once you know your true self, be true to that. Don't compromise it. Don't violate your own inner sense of being based on other people's expectations or trying to conform you to their image or who they think you should be. And so this is a huge struggle for authenticity. But you all know how much you appreciate an authentic person. It's so rare when you meet one that isn't putting on airs, that isn't worried about what other people think, that isn't worried about all these other things. Is that a new dog, Christina?
That's actually Nick's.
Is it?
Yes, it is.
It must just be the angle because I don't normally see his belly.
Actually, I'm surprised you haven't. She sleeps in class like on her back.
I know. I guess I'm just so focused in class, I don't normally notice. All right, so we got authenticity, be true to yourself, but first you have to know yourself before you can be true to it. Existentialists generally hate labels or categories. And this is part of why it's so difficult, because most existentialists are not going to want to identify as existentialists because then you're labeling them and they don't want to be labeled. Kierkegaard, this is one of his best quotes. He said, "If you label me, you negate me." And it's true, because once people put a label on you, like girl, boy, Christian, atheist, American, capitalist, communist, they've already have this idea of who you or what you are in their mind that they catalog in like the files of their mind. And it's just like Kierkegaard's like, once you categorize me, you're not dealing with me anymore. Now you're just dealing with this construct or this box you've put me in because it's convenient, because you don't want to deal with the wonder that is me as a unique individual. So, rejection of categories and labels. I love it. Many, not all, but many. You see how I'm qualifying almost everything? I even qualified that statement by almost everything. And I don't know if this is just being a philosopher or being a postmodern philosopher, but we're really reticent to make categorical, absolute statements. And so I'm really careful to try to qualify when I'm speaking, and existentialists especially so. Paradoxes. Existentialists will often embrace the paradox. And paradoxes are two apparently contradictory truths, where they shouldn't both be able to be true simultaneously, but it seems like they are. So a classic example would be the sovereignty of God, the free will of man. Those are mutually exclusive statements, but at least scripture seems to teach both. Now, a rationalist will choose one and then argue against the other, either the sovereignty of God, like Reformed theologians, or the free will of man, like most Baptists I know of. And or Arminians, right? You get this too, Calvin versus Arminian, free will versus sovereignty. But to the degree that God is sovereign, man's freedom is limited. And to the degree that man is free, God's sovereignty being total becomes less. And so how are you supposed to have both together? For the existentialists, they're just like, we embrace the paradox. We embrace both. We don't even care if it's not rational. And that's really interesting. And it's not rational, but they are not letting reason dominate their truth claims. For them, the highest truth claim is personal experience. And they would go so far to say, you only know, capital K know, what you have personally experienced. Everything else is just hearsay or head knowledge. Do you guys agree with that? You only really know what you personally experienced. Everything else is just hearsay or head knowledge.
I don't know how to answer that one.
How about you, Christina?
I don't know how to answer that either. Sorry. In case you're wondering, Nick's just wanted some loving. So I'm giving her loving while
I
I'm laughing.
think, I personally think it's 100% spot on true. And once again, we come to the difference between knowing about something and knowing something, or knowing about someone and knowing them personally. Like, we all know who Donald Trump is, but none of us, I think, know him personally, right? I don't have a personal relationship with Donald Trump, but I certainly know who he is. And I know things about him that may or may not be true, but things I think I know about him by reading the paper or watching news, etc. And the same thing goes, do you see the profound spiritual application, though? He turns that pivot of you only know what you've personally experienced to religion. And he's basically telling the Danish church, you talk about God, you read about God, you worship this God, but you don't know this God. You're worshiping that which you do not know because you've not experienced him. And unless you have a personal experience with Jesus, you don't know him. You may know about him, but you don't know him. So think about that. It's so weird to me because so many modern evangelicals are hostile towards Kierkegaard, but that whole figure of speech, personal relationship of Jesus, that's Kierkegaard 101. And how many evangelical churches, if you go there, you visit a Sunday or two, they're going to want to know, do you know Jesus personally? Do you have a personal relationship with our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ? Not have you read a Sunday school story about Jesus, or did you watch the documentary about Jesus, but do you know Jesus? Have you encountered the risen Christ? That's what makes you a Christian, encountering Jesus and being indwelt by the Holy Spirit. Not because you know the creeds, not because you can win arguments with Muslims or atheists. No, it's do you know? Have you experienced Jesus? I love it. And I think that's exactly the right question to be asking. But see, people weren't talking like that in the 19th century because we'd moved from the Middle Ages to the Age of Reason, and now Christianity was all rational. They had lost the experiential. And Kierkegaard's trying to bring them back to the bride. Back to the groom. We're the bride. Next would be, what else do I got? Truth is subjectivity. Oh, because truth is subjective. Oh, I didn't say that one yet, did I? Truth is subjectivity. I think that one got him excommunicated again. I think this guy got excommunicated like 7 times. I don't know. How do you get multiple excommunications? Maybe it's like multiple life sentences.
Hasn't almost every philosopher in history been excommunicated from the church?
If not, they probably should have been. I can't tell you how many times I've been called a heretic in church. And
You know, here's my thoughts on that. He came out with something, And they're like, ooh, you know what? We don't believe that. And then he came out with something else, and they're like, oh, we do believe that. And then he came out with something else, and they're like, no, we don't believe that, or that's absolutely crazy. You're out of here. And so they probably kick him out and bring him back in, and kick him out and bring him back in.
Probably. This idea that truth is subjective. Now, he's not denying there's objective truth. He's simply saying humans don't know what that is, because each and every one of us in the Zoom talk are subjective individuals. So any truth, even if I told you the most perfect, universal, absolute truth, as soon as it left my mouth and went into your ears, it would change. And it's kind of like what I was telling you about Wittgenstein the other day, because even the words or the experiences I'm using to try to communicate that truth to you, as it passes through your mind, through your filters, it's going to mean something different to you than it means to me, because we're not the same person. We don't have the same experiences, and it's going to be different. All truth is going to be subjective that way, though. Even if you read the Bible, and even if you believe the Bible just dropped out of heaven in its perfect state, which is not what we're teaching, right? But say it just dropped down, perfectly given by God, no human interference, no scribal errors, no nothing, just perfect. The moment you begin to interact with it, you begin to distort it and change it through your perspective, your subjective understanding. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Who's your favorite philosopher?
Man, it's tough. I sure love Kierkegaard, but Plato is just so dominant.
So
I
Plato's your
think
favorite?
so platonically. It's just how I think naturally so much. I think very platonically. But John Scotus Erigena just makes me giddy with joy with his cosmic loops. Anyways, we're running out of time, so I'm going to tell you more about Kierkegaard when we come back.
And no class Tuesday, right?
No, we won't meet at all next week. I just want us all to have a break. I know I need it. I'm sure you guys do too. Wayne, would you just write down a note for me of just the word fideism in case I forget where to pick up? That's how I do my lecture. I just need to know where the recording stopped.
Is it
FID? It's like deism with an FI at the beginning of it. FIDEISM, fideism, or fideism or fideist. Either one will work. It means faith over reason. If there's ever a conflict between your faith and your reason, a fideist says you gotta sacrifice your reason at the altar of faith. A rationalist would say, no, our faith needs to be rational. Otherwise, we're not following it. All right. Well, have a nice Thanksgiving.
I will.
And if you ever want to talk about estranged wives and that sort of stuff, I'm available.
Okay.
And that's been one of the hardest things I've ever had to deal with in my own life. What a devastation.
Yeah, it absolutely is. But what are you going to do with the crayons God gave you?
What's that?
What are you going to do with the crayons God gave you?
That's true. Or the crayons that you lose along the way. All right.
Yeah. Yep. So, all right. I hope you have a blessed weekend and have a blessed Thanksgiving. And I pray your back is 100% healed.
Well, I didn't even notice it once I started talking about philosophy, so that's a great sign.
That's good.
Now that class is over, I can feel it a little, but that was really nice to have an hour break. Yeah. I'm going to teach at a men's conference up in the Mojave on Saturday. So I'm just hoping the drive up won't set me back.
That's
It's not
cool.
that far. It's only like 3.5 hours. And,
Yeah, I'm. As soon as this class is
it should
over,
be good.
yeah, as soon as this class is over, I'm heading over to discipleship over at the church. We're going over a book called like the Three Kings or something like that.
Are those metaphors for something?
Yeah, basically, it's I can't remember the exact name of it.
I'm going to stop this recording, but we'll keep talking.
Okay, yeah.